The sixth essay in Schopenhauer's Studies in Pessimism is titled On Education. In it, Schopenhauer first distinguishes between what he calls the natural method and the artificial method of education, and he uses this distinction to diagnose various problems that will come up in the worldview and the actions of people who are educated in the wrong way. After speaking a bit more about the hazards of getting the order of ideas and observations wrong in our education, he provides us with a practical guide for a method of natural education of the youth. He gives us, by my count, 5 specific actions we might take, and I'll detail those when we come to that section. He then describes what perfect knowledge, the perfection of human knowledge, would and should look like, and concludes with a kind of postscript about the hazards of reading novels. Novel reading, he seems to think, is quite dangerous, with a few exceptions. There are some novels of which he approves. We'll come to those at the very end of the essay. Right now, here is Schopenhauer on education. The human intellect is said to be so constituted that general ideas arise by abstraction from particular observations, and therefore come after them in point of time. If this is what actually occurs, as happens in the case of a man who has to depend solely upon his own experience for what he learns, who has no teacher and no book, such a man knows quite well which of his particular observations belong to and are represented by each of his general ideas. He has a perfect acquaintance with both sides of his experience, and accordingly he treats everything that comes in his way from a right standpoint. This might be called the natural method of education. Contrarily, the artificial method is to hear what other people say, to learn and to read, and so to get your head crammed full of general ideas before you have any sort of extended acquaintance with the world as it is, and as you may see it for yourself. You will be told that the particular observations which go to make these general ideas will come to you later on in the course of experience. But until that time arrives, you apply your general ideas wrongly. You judge men and things from a wrong standpoint. You see them in a wrong light and treat them in a wrong way. So it is that education perverts the mind. This explains why it is so frequently happens that after a long course of learning and reading, we enter upon the world in our youth partly with an artless ignorance of things, partly with wrong notions about them, so that our demeanor savors at one moment of a nervous anxiety and another of a mistaken confidence. The reason of this is simply that our head is full of general ideas which we are now trying to turn to some use, but which we hardly ever apply rightly. This is the result of acting in direct opposition to the natural development of the mind by obtaining general ideas first and particular observations last. It is putting the cart before the horse. Instead of developing the child's own faculties of discernment and teaching it to judge and think for itself, the teacher uses all his energies to stuff its head full of the ready-made thoughts of other people. The mistaken views of life which spring from a false application of general ideas have afterwards to be corrected by long years of experience, and it is seldom that they are wholly corrected. This is why so few men of learning are possessed of common sense, such as is often to be met with in people who have had no instruction at all. I'll pause there for a comment. Schopenhauer's described for us 2 methods of education, one that begins with observation and abstracts ideas only from the observations and experiences that the individual has had. The idea here being that the ideas sort of grow naturally out of your experiences, and you are able to trace them back effectively to their origin point. Since they belong to you, you grew them at home, we might say. This other method, which he identifies with teachers in schools, is to take the child relatively deprived of experience and stuff his head full of general ideas that don't match anything in his experience, with the idea that he'll kind of grow into the ideas. He'll go have the experiences later which will verify for him the truth of the ideas. But as Schopenhauer points out, if the ideas are not linked to experiences and observations of the child himself, then his application of them will be haphazard and dangerous, and will result in this mistaken worldview and mistaken judgments. So this is the danger of the artificial method, which Schopenhauer associates with schooling, versus this natural method where the ideas follow naturally from the experiences of the world that each student has had. We might have fewer ideas, we would suppose, but they would be our own, and we would be secure in using them, and we would be more likely to use them correctly. So let's go on back to Schopenhauer and see what more he says. To acquire a knowledge of the world might be defined as the aim of all education, and it follows from what I have said that special stress should be laid upon beginning to acquire this knowledge at the right end. As I have shown, this means in the main that the particular observation of a thing shall precede the general idea of it. Further, that narrow and circumscribed ideas shall come before ideas of a wide range. It means, therefore, that the whole system of education shall follow in the steps that must have been taken by the ideas themselves in the course of their formation. But whenever any of these steps are skipped or left out, the instruction is defective, and the ideas obtained are false. And finally, a distorted view of the world arises, peculiar to the individual himself, a view such as almost everyone entertains for some time, and most men for as long as they live. No one can look into his own mind without seeing that it was only after reaching a very mature age, and in some cases, when he least expected it, that he came to a right understanding or a clear view of many matters in his life that, after all, were not very complicated. Up till then, there were points in his knowledge of the world which were still obscure, due to his having skipped some particular lesson in those early days of his education, whatever it may have been like, whether artificial and conventional, or of that natural kind which is based upon individual experience. It follows that an attempt should be made to find out the strictly natural course of knowledge, so that education may proceed methodically by keeping to it, and that children may become acquainted with the ways of the world without getting wrong ideas into their heads, which very often cannot be got out again. If this plan were adopted, special care would have to be taken to prevent children from using words without clearly understanding their meaning and application. The fatal tendency to be satisfied with words instead of trying to understand things, to learn phrases by heart so that they may prove a refuge in time of need, exists, as a rule, even in children, and the tendency lasts on into manhood, making the knowledge of many learned persons to consist in mere verbiage. And this is, I'll just add, the mystification of words. Right? We think of being highly educated as using words really, really well, and the more advanced words you use, the more magnificent you sound. Wow, the wiser you must be. But this is a shallow approach, and it's premised upon this wrong method of education. I think Schopenhauer is saying what we need to do is to make sure that our ideas don't overrun our observations and experiences. Back to the text. However, the main endeavor must always be to let particular observations precede general ideas, and not vice versa, as is usually and unfortunately the case, as though a child should come feet foremost into the world, or a verse be begun by writing down the rhyme. The ordinary method is to imprint ideas and opinions, in the strict sense of the word, prejudices, on the mind of the child, before it has had any but a very few particular observations. It is thus that he afterwards comes to view the world and gather experience through the medium of those ready-made ideas, rather than to let his ideas be formed for him out of his own experience of life, as they ought to be. A man sees a great many things when he looks at the world for himself, and he sees them from many sides. But this method of learning is not nearly so short or so quick as the method which employs abstract ideas and makes hasty generalizations about everything. Experience, therefore, will be a long time in correcting preconceived ideas, or perhaps never bring its task to an end. For wherever a man finds that the aspect of things seems to contradict the general ideas he has formed, he will begin by rejecting the evidence it offers as partial or one-sided. Nay, he will shut his eyes to it altogether, and deny that it stands in any contradiction at all with his preconceived notions, in order that he may thus preserve them uninjured. So it is that many a man carries about a burden of wrong notions all his life long, crotchets, whims, fancies, prejudices, which at last become fixed ideas. The fact is that he has never tried to form his fundamental ideas for himself out of his own experience of life, his own way of looking at the world, because he has taken over his ideas ready-made from other people. And this it is that makes him, as it makes how many others, so shallow and superficial. I'll pause here before we get to the next part. Schopenhauer, I think, a fantastic description of a certain kind of miseducation as impressing prejudices, a certain kind of worldview, a certain kind of certain framework of ideas onto the child's mind, which then the child, and then later the adult, will use to sift through and interpret the evidence, rejecting some evidence as being one-sided or somehow distorted because it doesn't fit his preconceived notions, his preconceived worldview. I'm sure we're all familiar with this in the realm of political ideologies, where people will dismiss evidence that seems to present troubles for their ideas because they are so attached to the ideas. I think Schopenhauer is diagnosing a problem rather like this in a more general way. If we begin by cramming kids' heads full of ideas, the kids then will interpret the world and behave in the world in a certain fashion, which is not in keeping with what it ought to be. Okay. He also mentions that this use of ideas is easier and it's faster. And so we might even think our tendency to be kind of lazy and to take shortcuts will incline us to apply ideas rather than to draw ideas out of the experiences that we've had. And this accounts both for why many of us would tend to prefer the method of ideas first, and also why it takes so long and it's so difficult for experience to correct mistaken ideas once we have them. The working of drawing correct ideas out of experience is slow and tedious and careful. The work of applying ideas as like a sort of rigid ideological framework to experiences, much simpler, much easier, but it amounts to cutting the world to fit our ideas that we've brought, our prejudices that we've brought to it. And that is clearly, Schopenhauer thinks, a mistake. In the next section of the essay, Schopenhauer is going to give us his agenda for natural education of the youth. It has 5 parts. I think the 5 parts to look for are: first, no ideas should be taught to the child unless they are verified by observation and experience. Second, the child should focus upon things and not books. Third, children should study no really serious high subjects prior to the age of 15. Fourth, there should be efforts made to tax the memory of students, especially. And fifth, students should memorize essentials, the essentials being determined by experts in each field. So that's my quick summary of the 5 points of Schopenhauer's practical agenda for natural education. Here's what he writes. Instead of that method of instruction, care should be taken to educate children on the natural lines. No idea should ever be established in a child's mind otherwise than by what the child can see for itself, or at any rate, it should be verified by the same means. And the result of this would be that the child's ideas, if few, would be well grounded and accurate. It would learn how to measure things by its own standard rather than by another's. And so it would escape 1,000 strange fancies and prejudices, and not need to have them eradicated by the lessons it will subsequently be taught in the school of life. The child would, in this way, have its mind once for all habituated to clear views and thoroughgoing knowledge. It would use its own judgment and take an unbiased estimate of things. And in general, children should not form their notions of what life is like from the copy before they have learned it from the original. to whatever aspect of it their attention may be directed. Instead, therefore, of hastening to place books and books alone in their hands, let them be made acquainted step by step with things, with actual circumstances of human life. And above all, let care be taken to bring them to a clear and objective view of the world as it is, to educate them always to derive their ideas directly from real life and to shape them in conformity with it, not to fetch them from other sources, such as books, fairy tales, or what people say, and then to apply them ready-made to real life. For this will mean that their heads are full of wrong notions, and they will either see things in a false light or try in vain to remodel the world to suit their views, and so enter upon false paths. And that, too, whether they are only constructing theories of life or engaged in the actual business of it. It is incredible how much harm is done when the seeds of wrong notions are laid in the mind in those early years, later on to bear a crop of prejudice. For the subsequent lessons which are learned from real life in the world have to be devoted mainly to their extirpation. To unlearn the evil was the answer, according to Diogenes Laertius, Antisthenes gave when he was asked what branch of knowledge was most necessary, and we can see what he meant. No child under the age of 15 should receive instruction in subjects which may possibly be the vehicle of serious error, such as philosophy, religion, or any other branch of knowledge where it is necessary to take large views, because wrong notions imbibed early can seldom be rooted out, and of all the intellectual faculties, judgment is the last to arrive at maturity. The child should give its attention either to subjects where no error is possible at all, such as mathematics, or to those in which there is no particular danger in making a mistake, such as languages, natural science, history, and so on. And in general, the branches of knowledge which are to be studied at any period of life should be such as the mind is equal to at that period and can perfectly understand. Childhood and youth form the time for collecting materials, for getting a special and thorough knowledge of the individual and particular things. In those years, it is too early to form views on a large scale, and ultimate explanations must be put off to a later date. The faculty of judgment, which cannot come into play without mature experience, should be left to itself, and care should be taken not to anticipate its action by inculcating prejudice, which will paralyze it forever. On the other hand, the memory should be specially taxed in youth, since it is then that it is strongest and most tenacious. But in choosing the things that should be committed to memory, the utmost care and forethought must be exercised, as lessons learnt in youth are never forgotten. This precious soil must therefore be cultivated so as to bear as much fruit as possible. If you think how deeply rooted in your memory are those persons whom you knew in the first 12 years of your life, how indelible the impression made upon you by the events of those years, how clear your recollection of most of the things that happened to you then, most of what was told or taught you, it will seem a natural thing to take the susceptibility and tenacity of the mind at that period as the groundwork of education. This may be done by a strict observance of method and a systematic regulation of the impressions which the mind is to receive. But the years of youth allotted to a man are short, and memory is, in general, bound within narrow limits, still more so the memory of any one individual. Since this is the case, it is all important to fill the memory with what is essential and material in any branch of knowledge, to the exclusion of everything else. The decision as to what is essential and material should rest with the masterminds in every department of thought. Their choice should be made after the most mature deliberation, and the outcome of it fixed and determined. Such a choice would have to be preceded by sifting the things which it is necessary and important for a man to know in general, and then necessary and important for him to know in any particular business or calling. Knowledge of the first kind would have to be classified after an encyclopedic fashion, in graduated courses, adapted to the degree of general culture which a man may be expected to have in the circumstances in which he is placed, beginning with a course limited to the necessary requirements of primary education, and extending upwards to the subjects treated of in all the branches of philosophical thought. The regulation of the second kind of knowledge would be left to those who had shown genuine mastery in the several departments into which it is divided, and the whole system would provide an elaborate rule or canon for intellectual education, which would, of course, have to be revised every 10 years. Some such arrangement as this would employ the youthful power of the memory to best advantage and supply excellent working material to the faculty of judgment when it makes its appearance later on. That, I think, is the conclusion of Schopenhauer's practical agenda for reform of education. I do notice the emphasis he places upon taxing the memory of youth and withholding from them any subjects which might require judgment, since judgment is a more mature faculty. It would be expected to occur in children somewhat later. And also for them to avoid studying any subjects where they might make a mistake that would distort or affect their entire worldview. So study of philosophy, theology, and similar sort of grand scale subjects with large answers should be postponed while they build from the ground up with this knowledge of ideas drawn from experience. So I think if you go back and reread those parts, you can pick out a kind of practical agenda for elementary and secondary education from what Schopenhauer has said here. I think it's quite fascinating and how some of its elements overlap some current 21st century thinking about youth education. Above all, he does think one needs to avoid inculcating prejudice, that is, giving children a ready-made worldview which they can apply off the shelf to the different experiences that they have. What we're doing is sort of growing and cultivating something which should come up along with the child's experiences. And so focusing upon things and not books seems to me like it is very solid advice. Back to Schopenhauer now. A man's knowledge may be said to be mature. In other words, it has reached the most complete state of perfection to which he as an individual is capable of bringing it when an exact correspondence is established between the whole of his abstract ideas and the things which he has actually perceived for himself. This will mean that each of his abstract ideas rests, directly or indirectly, upon the basis of observation, which alone endows it with any real value, and also that he is able to place every observation he makes under the right abstract idea which belongs to it. Maturity is the work of experience alone, and therefore it requires time. The knowledge we derive from our own observation is usually distinct from that which we acquire through the medium of abstract ideas, the one coming to us in the natural way, the other by what people tell us, and the course of instruction we receive, whether it is good or bad. The result is that in youth there is generally very little agreement or correspondence between our abstract ideas, which are merely phrases in the mind, and that real knowledge which we have obtained by our own observation. It is only later on that a gradual approach takes place between these two kinds of knowledge, accompanied by a mutual correction of error, and knowledge is not mature until this coalition is accomplished. This maturity or perfection of knowledge is something quite independent of another kind of perfection, which may be of a high or a low order. The perfection, I mean, to which a man may bring his own individual faculties, which is measured not by any correspondence between the two kinds of knowledge, but by the degree and intensity which each kind attains. For the practical man, the most needful thing is to acquire an accurate and profound knowledge of the ways of the world. But this, though the most needful, is also the most wearisome of all studies, as a man may reach a great age without coming to the end of his task, whereas, in the domain of the sciences, he masters the more important facts when he is still young. In acquiring that knowledge of the world, it is while he is a novice, namely in boyhood and in youth, that the first and hardest lessons are put before him. But it often happens that even in later years there is still a great deal to be learned. Schopenhauer here is describing the perfection of knowledge, We might think of this both in terms of its synthesis or convergence. We want our general ideas and our practical knowledge, the two kinds of knowledge that we have, to be combined and sort of synthesized into one whole, and also the depth and intensity of each kind of knowledge, which is independent of this. And we might discover that our strength lies in one area or in the other. And he concludes as well that for the practical man, what is most needed is a knowledge of the ways of the world, but this is extremely difficult, and of course we ought to begin with fundamentals in youth. Okay, now to conclude the essay. The study is difficult enough in itself, but the difficulty is doubled by novels, which represent a state of things in life and in the world, such as, in fact, does not exist. Youth is credulous and accepts these views of life, which then become part and parcel of the mind, so that instead of a merely negative condition of ignorance, you have positive error, a whole tissue of false notions to start with, and at a later date, these actually spoil the schooling of experience and put a wrong construction on the lessons it teaches. If before this the youth had no light at all to guide him, he is now misled by a will-o'-the-wisp, and still more often is this the case with a girl. They have both had a false view of things foisted on them by reading novels, and expectations have been aroused which can never be fulfilled. This generally exercises a baneful influence on their whole life. In this respect, those whose youth has allowed them no time or opportunity for reading novels, those who work with their hands and the like, are in a position of decided advantage. There are a few novels to which this reproach cannot be addressed, nay, which have in effect the contrary of bad. First and foremost, to give an example, Gil Blas and the other works of Lesage, or rather their Spanish originals. Further, The Vicar of Wakefield, and to some extent Sir Walter Scott's novels. Don Quixote may be regarded as a satirical exhibition of the error to which I am referring. So here is Schopenhauer's conclusion of the essay on education, a warning against the reading of novels. Why? Because they present a false picture in very vivid imagery, and read in youth, they place a false kind of romantic vision of what life will be like, complete with a flawed set of expectations of life, which will distort and perhaps ruin the education and the life experience of the child as an adult, especially the case with girls. He's writing this around in the first half of the 19th century, 1850 or so. So he's thinking maybe especially of the sort of revolution in novels in England and elsewhere, I'm sure. With people, novel reading, he thinks, sets people up for failure in terms of their education. He does approve of a couple of novels that he lists here at the end. And the last invocation of Don Quixote, I think, should bring to our mind the kind of the satire of the novel reader. Who is Quixote? He's a man who takes the story seriously. And so he sees windmills, but he confronts giants. And so he's caught in his own fantasy world, and he behaves like a buffoon as a result. And I think Schopenhauer here is warning against novel reading, which we might chuckle at, but we might apply it in our own time to the watching of certain kinds of fantasy movies or television. Children who imbibe a great deal of television come up with wrong expectations, a framework, a wrong set of ideas, and a distorted worldview with regard to the opposite sex, to material things, to any number of other things, what is politically possible and impossible in this world or in the economy. And it seems that those kind of distorted ideas, the sources of those distorted ideas are things which certainly should be kept away from impressionable children, I think, on Schopenhauer's view. So that is my reading and commentary of Schopenhauer's essay on education. The next essay in Studies in Pessimism is his infamous Of Women. We'll take a look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.